Welcome to Fools with Tools. I'm Tori, and I'll be your fool for today.
I'm Zach, and today I'll be your pump.
Your what?
Your pump. Like a shock pump.
Zach. So, Zach, what is SAG? What are we doing this week? Just what? What, if you will?
So sag on your suspension is going to be essentially when you're sitting on the saddle or kind of in a neutral riding position on the bike.
Well, where else would you sit?
You can sit on the tire, you can sit on the handlebars. You know, when you're a kid, you sit on the handlebars with your friends.
Such a good point.
Exactly.
Romance.
But your sag is referring to how much actual suspension is being compressed when your body weight is on the bike. Now it's referring to on the shock as well as on the fork. So we got Fool here with a Santa Cruz Bronson that we're gonna use to check. We are ready to kind of start going through and checking sag. Sag is always easier done when you have a friend to do it with. The other person is gonna help you with supporting the bike, holding you up, and checking the actual level of the bike and seeing where this suspension is currently sitting with its pressure. It just makes it a lot easier across the board. If you don't have a friend, another way you can do it is by going
First off, I'm sorry.
You can go to a wall or something like that and kind of just support yourself up a little bit.
You will need that support.
That usually works. All right, so kind of ready to get on this. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna straddle the front wheel and hold the handlebars so you can go ahead and jump on.
Like a pretty princess getting on a steed.
Just like that, yeah. So best thing we wanna do is we wanna make sure the suspension is nice and freed up. So actually go ahead and get your feet on the pedals, stand up on the bike, kind of bounce it around a few times, really get that suspension moving around.
I don't like this.
Yeah, just like that, that totally works. Now, what I'm gonna do is while supporting you, I'm gonna go ahead and move our sag rings up to the actual shock body.
I am shifting to the right.
That's okay. And go ahead and slowly hop off. Perfect. Let's go ahead and check those measurements. Now that we have our sag rings placed in the position where we can measure them, we can wanna go ahead and take either a ruler or a tape measure, something that we can easily measure the distance, starting with the fork, from the seal to where the sag ring sits. For fork settings, generally you're gonna want between around 15 to 20% of your total fork travel. In this case, our fork has 160 millimeters of travel. About 15-20% of that is about 30 millimeters, give or take. 30 millimeters will be somewhere in the middle setting where 20% would be very plush, 15% would be very stiff. This is around 18-ish%, somewhere in the middle. So we can just go ahead and take our ruler, thanks for holding it, and we can see that we have about only 20 millimeters of total sag. So we're running about 33%-ish too stiff, around there. So we wanna go ahead and definitely drop some pressure out of this and get closer to 20% of our total travel. So when we're looking at the rear shock and we wanna make sure that we're setting sag properly with this, where the fork, we're generally looking around 15 to 20% width. On a rear shock, you're generally gonna want around 25 to 35%. More of your weight is going to be focused on the rear end of the bike as opposed to the front. So our pressure settings are gonna be way higher with this as well. In general, I would say most suspension pressures for your rear suspension are gonna be about 10% below body weight to around 15% above body weight. That's a general setting that most companies are gonna be adhering to, whether it's from the frame manufacturers or the rear shock manufacturers. So we know the suspension is a little too stiff for little Tori here. It's definitely set up for a bigger rider currently. So we're definitely gonna wanna drop some air pressure out of this fork here. So we can just go ahead and take our cap off. What I always like to do is I'll check the suspension pressure that it's at currently to kind of give us a baseline and kind of see what we're working with. The next best step after that would be to check the suspension chart that most forks nowadays come with. It's usually on the lower legs somewhere, and that'll give you a kind of baseline pressure to start with and give you a good kind of starting point to go off of and really fine tune from there. On this fork, it is on the right side, and we're gonna wanna set pressure around 68 to 70 PSI as a general range. And this fork is currently set at about 80 PSI.
Ooh, that's a lot for a little thing.
Which definitely makes sense as to why it was reading very little sag for you. Now we want to go through and actually adjust the suspension pressure for Tori. In this case, we are gonna wanna drop pressure. In your case, you may also need to be dropping pressure, or chances are you're probably gonna need to be increasing pressure. I would say that's what most of the time when you're setting sags, you're probably gonna be adding more pressure to this.
Most people can't be as little as me.
This is true. So in this case, the best way to do that when you're actually going to be changing pressure, whether increasing or decreasing, is as you drop the pressure, you're going to want to be going through and actually cycling the suspension as you do that too. Every suspension product has both a positive air and a negative air chamber. And in order to get those points to equalize the pressures between the two, the suspension has to be cycled a little bit to get to that point. So I would say as you're going through the pressure, every 10, 20 PSI for a fork, every 50 PSI for a shock, just kind of stop, cycle the suspension a bunch, let those chambers equalize, and kind of move forward from there. Another thing to note is when you're connecting a shock pump, pressure from the fork does have to go into the hose to inflate the shock pump itself. So we do have to kind of take note of that, of like, hey, when I connect my shock pump, this may not be the actual pressure that was in there, because now we're inflating the hose section as well. So it's a little bit higher air volume. Generally, what I like to go off of is when you connect a shock pump, of course, it's always gonna be a little different. For a suspension fork, that's, I would say, usually around 5 PSI air loss when you connect a hose. And shocks, I would say, are usually around 8 to 10 PSI. Just kind of as a general rule of thumb to follow, that's what you can bias for. One key thing to note is that when you're going to be checking your sag after you've done your initial pressure changes in whatever direction you need to go, you want to make sure you're doing both your changes to your fork and your shock at the same time. One reason for that is because if let's just say your shock is way overpressurized and you set your fork to where it needs to be, all your weight is going to be biased towards compressing the fork instead. So we want to make sure we're doing both and then rechecking our sag. So now we've done both our fork and we just end up doing our shock as well. So we want to make sure we're doing both at the same time so we get some good measurements. So let's go ahead and recheck our sag levels.
And I'm back on my mighty steed.
Awesome. Remember, when I go ahead and kind of free it up a little bit. Jump around.
Jump.
Trademark.
Jump.
Can't use that.
Jump. Oh yeah.
Awesome.
Copyright.
All right, cool. Let's go ahead and bring our sag rings up.
Whoa. Whoa.
Cool. Now that our sag is adjusted on the bike, the last thing we want to kind of look at is just to make sure that if your fork has them, the general settings for the compression and the rebound for both the fork and the shock are set to usually like a manufacturer's recommended settings. That's always a good place to start. They know best, it's their product, so it's always best to kind of just set it where they would recommend you to based on your weight and your air pressure in order to kind of get a good feel out of it. Let's just say if you don't end up doing that and you leave all of your adjustments either wide open or all the way closed, it can really affect the actual riding characteristics and performance in a negative light. So it's always good just to kind of make sure that everything's just nice in check. We're here, it's a very easy thing. You don't need tools to adjust these. It's a very simple adjustment. All of that should be listed on the manufacturer's, their website. You can give them the tune code on the back of your fork, on the shock, and it'll give you a small setup chart for the actual tuning portions of it. For rock shocks, they're also going to have some basic general tuning guides for their fork and their shock as just general baseline. Cane Creek, DVO, Olin's, I believe, all make those as well. Those are all going to be, again, on their respective websites.
Thanks for joining us in this week's episode of Fools with Tools. So this is part 1. I think we're going to need a part 2 for this one. Suspension as a whole, it's an ocean. We're swimming through it.
There's a lot to go through.
So join us for part 2, where we're going to be taking this thing out on the trail and going through some more different tricks.
We get to do some riding.
We have to do some riding. We actually know how to do that. But for this week, if you want any instructions, including a list of like what tools we use, pictures, etc., it's all going to be linked below and on thepathbikeshop.com. So check that out if you want a less Zach version of this. But for us this week, I was Tori and I was your fool.
I'm Zach and I was your pump.
We'll see you next time.